This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Thank you, Rebecca. I just can't think about that right now. Right. Don't, and I'm good. That's great. Look, I'll have to talk to you later on. I'm actually about to give a lecture. I sent you a message. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I'll talk to you later. I said I'm standing in front of 200 people about to give a lecture. There's a way.
the one towards the bottom, David, that had the file sizes were.
Yeah, which one would you...
The ones that had got 1, 2, 3 were some 50 gigabytes, so those were probably bigger video files.
I wonder why would there be a 1, 2 and 3 and 4 of those?
It might have chapters or something like
Yeah,
that.
chapters would be a hassle. That's why, That's why I sort of like this one, but that's on 29.
Because that's such a small file.
You're right.
It's
You're quite,
probably
thank you. That's true. 88. This is so annoying. It's a DVD.
yeah.
It's playing, is that?
That looks like something's happening.
Yes.
All right. Perfect. All right. Until I find out it won't play sound or whatever. Okay, so great. Thank you very much for your tolerant patience. What I want to do in this 2-hour session, the first hour, I want to show you a film that was made in the early 70s. It's described as a consensus documentary. So it's ostensibly... that noise is going to be really interesting, isn't it, over the next 2 hours? It's a documentary film wherein people who live in a new housing estate have been invited to make sections of film about their own lives. It's a new housing estate on the outskirts of Sydney. It's I think, a very relevant thing to look at in this session when we're talking about equality and democracy. It gives us for crying out loud, there's just like they're pulling half this freaking campus down, and it's obviously all done to drive me insane. Early 70s, it's a time when people are being asked to look into, taking control of their urban lives, and they're being invited to be a part of of discourse about how they might live. So this film it's a rare piece of, it's a rare film. It's really hard to access, and I couldn't link you to a YouTube version of it or anything, even if I wanted to, because it's actually, to a certain degree, it's been, how can I put it, hidden in a way. The director of the film is Peter Weir, who you may know of. He's one of the most successful Hollywood directors these days, probably still. He hasn't made a film for a while. But he was an architecture student at the University of Sydney, who then went into filmmaking, went into television, and from there went to Hollywood, and has made a name for himself. I think, I know he made Master and Commander, but I can't remember how long ago that was or whether there's been anything since. Anyway, that's not important, although he does appear in the film, and he tries his hand at comedy early in the movie, which probably depends on how broad and embracing your sense of humour is, whether you find that funny or not. But you'll see him there. So from that point of view, it's mildly interesting. But I think what's more interesting is the way that these people have been asked to come on board and make films about their lives. You get a really good sense. It's a period piece. It's a 45-year-old film, I think, but it also has quite a bit of resonance in the present day as well, particularly when you think about sort of things that I may touch on later about stigmatisation and the demonisation of suburbia, and questions of what kind of lives people can or should expect. In this case, when they're in public housing, which is what I think most of this housing is. Certainly if they're not actually government-owned houses, I think they possibly are. So straight ahead public housing, but also they've been essentially placed there, one way or the other, or invited there. And I guess I'll touch on this later on in the second half of this session. They've been Many of them have gone there from the inner suburbs of Sydney, so they've been essentially relocated, probably not by force, but possibly by social expectation and perhaps, government agency suggestion. And they have, in that sense, been taken out of the inner city and therefore been they're no longer an obstruction to the gentrification process. But that's not something that's directly discussed here, although you do see some footage of early 70s Balmain, which is Balmain is now one of the most highly sought after areas of Sydney, and it's discussed in this film as being, I guess a place that's no good to bring children up in and those kinds of things. Okay, so without further ado, I want to talk to you about, or I want to show you this film, Whatever Happened to Green Valley. I'll talk about it a little more afterwards, and then we'll get into some of the other issues that are raised and subsequent issues from this. Okay.
Valley is the name given to a group of suburbs located 25 miles from the centre of the city of Sydney. The valley was built by the New South Wales Housing Commission between 1961 and 1964 to provide subsidised accommodation for 6,000 families. The population today is 28,000 people. In 1973, Film Australia went to the valley to make a documentary film. During the research period for that film, it was decided to ask local people to make their own films about their own suburb. The resulting films were screened to an invited audience of local people. Just to fill you in a little on the unusual presentation of this film, because it is quite unusual, it goes back to the research period where Susan Varga and I, my research assistant, first came down to Green Valley. And the reaction that we struck from you people, many of you, at first was most unusual. You said, oh no, not another film, not the knockers back again. What point of view are you going to present? Are you going to send us up again? That kind of thing. And when we got into the research and began to look back through the newspaper files, it was there that we discovered the reason for this attitude. Here are just some examples of things. Teething problems for the valley. The valley with too many kids. Deserted wives call it a valley of despair. Town with a 7-year itch. Some call it Black Valley. Valley of Despair, Dodge City, another look at the valley. What's more, this publicity, although it occurred some years ago, still goes on. The most recent example was just a couple of weeks ago. The heading, Too Much Sky, Too Few Cars and Jobs for the Transplanted Poor of Green Valley. So in other words, it still continues, not just here, but in other suburbs, in other cities, in other areas, other subjects. And it all goes back to the press and the approach that they take when they're supposedly being objective. So I made a little kind of satire, it's a send-up comic film, about the sort of reporting that does go on. So let's have a look at that particular film. And as you're looking at it, I ask you the question, I pose you the question, but is it so very far from the sort of thing that you see every night on television? Green Valley, a social experiment, a suburb virtually created overnight. It's 10 years since the first of the families moved in, 10 long, weary years, and it's still called the Valley of Doom. What of the ordinary people who live here?
What of their hopes and dreams? What of the things they hoped life would bring? Has it been brought to them in Green Valley? Have their promises been met? I don't think so. An expert on loneliness has estimated that loneliness has increased by 18.7% since the valley was first settled. Take R.J. of Busby, a boat builder by trade, who is perhaps a typical resident. He has been out of work since he first moved to the valley. There's no local boat building in the area, and with 17 children, 7 of them adopted Vietnamese war orphans, he finds life in the valley since his recent accident very difficult. He speaks little English, and since his wife deserted him 3 years ago, life in the valley has been a nightmare, and R.J. is typical. What of other minority groups? For example, the deserted wives. Here a contingent of them out to do their afternoon shopping. Are they being given a chance? A chance to meet new people? I think not. And what of the alcoholics? The aged, the crippled, the Jews, the Arabs, the Irish. Ironically, they call it Green Valley, and yet there's few trees. Here we see a typical Green Valley tree, struggling for survival in the hard, dry, cracked soil of Green Valley, dried out by the merciless summer sun, which turns the valley into a steaming fry pan. Let's take a few measurements and see how this tree compares with trees in other suburbs. Height, a pathetic 49 inches. Distance from fence, a mere 41. And let's check the width of these leaves. Under 2 inches for a typical width of leaf. I think these measurements speak for themselves. I don't think you have to be an expert to know what these measurements mean. The experiment has been a failure. This tree symbolizes Green Valley. Is there any point in carrying on? Speaking to the people in the area, we were constantly told of their desperation. There. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us? I know sometimes the load seems very heavy, even in my work. As for the present, Green Valley can be compared to a kind of giant ocean liner. The residents are likely passengers, and this giant ship, without a captain or a rudder, is listing badly and may sink. One can be certain of one thing. The lifeboat belonging to the crew will be the first away. Yes, Green Valley is the Titanic. Facts like these make us face the future, when we may have to honestly admit the experiment has been a failure. Yes, we may have to face evacuation. Suburbs like this and others may have to be, in fact, closed down, evacuated, and scenes like these may become commonplace. A solution could be to move to a decent suburb like the North Shore's Killara. After all, most people would want to live here. Here, amongst the peace, the quiet, the beauty, evacuees could be temporarily placed in the tree-filled local parks until alternative accommodation was built or rented.
looked at the facts objectively. And those in power had better heed our warning. This is Andrew Davies signing off. And remember, the spotlight may be on your suburb next week. So much for Andrew Davies. It does make you wonder just what is happening with our media, where to get the ratings or whatever the reason is, they're turning news and reporting into entertainment. And they're presenting reporters' points of view after a couple of days summing up of a place as facts. I'd like you to meet the filmmakers, your local people. All of these people here worked on their films and supervised them and directed them in the true sense. They supervised everything that went into them. To just briefly introduce you to them, there's Stephen Jerd and Wayne Emerson, who worked together on their film and photographed a large part of it. There's Sandra Waterston, who's a final year student here at Ashcroft High School. Frank Scambry, who also photographed a large part of his film. Dot Toomey, who became very interested in the editing period, where she worked quite well with the editor on deciding what and what not to use. And Ron Whittle, who photographed all of his film. And we're going to start with Ron's film. So let's have a look at the residents' films.
Well, that was work down here at Balmain, trying to bring a young family up. At the time we had 2 children. It was very hard. You couldn't get flats. All that were available, the rent was too high. So we found ourselves living in rooms, room and a kitchenette. Pretty depressing things, especially for the wife. For myself, it wasn't too bad. I could go to work and get out of the house a bit. With a couple of kids, living in these cramped conditions, it was very depressing. If the kids wanted to play at all, you had the backyard, which is a small concrete square. In a lot of the cases, the kids just played out in the back lane. There's parks around, but most times it's too far to walk. I think perhaps one of the happiest things that ever happened to us down here was the day we received the telegram. You have a house in Green Valley. Oh, what a feeling. I told my wife. We were hellishly excited. Anyway, at 5 o'clock the next morning, we decided to come up here and have a look at the place. Even in its raw state, no trees, no gardens, much. It was beautiful, really beautiful. We started to lose a little bit of our enthusiasm about the valley. Not so much the valley. We had a little money, so we could pay a bit of cash for some furniture. But then we had to go for finance. We found that going to some of these stores, they just didn't want to do business with you. You mention you come from Green Valley, they'd say, oh yeah, Dodge City. I didn't know what they meant by this Dodge City business. We managed to get finance, quite a bit of debt. The big thing we found up here was for the children. They really had somewhere to move around. Once the backyard had the grass established, you could put them out there, they could play. The kids, the very first day, they're sort of playing with the next door neighbours' kids. The firm friendships were formed just straight away. With the adults, it takes a little bit more time, but it sorts itself out. I'm very happy. I'm very pleased with all the people up here. They're nice people. You left all your own friends down the city area. It was just a matter of making new friends. Of course, you couldn't be travelling the 23 miles into the city to visit and back again. Whereas in the city, it takes 10 minutes, quarter of an hour to get to a job on the wharves. Up here, it takes an hour, hour and a half. Puts another 2 hours onto your day. Trying to adapt into the new environment, all these things. They had a lot to do with this matrimonial trouble we had up here. I think the valley has its share of deserted wives, but you find deserted wives everywhere. In the city you don't have pets very much, but with all the room you've got up here, you find that every house has a pet of some description. We've had lizards, cats, dogs. One thing you noticed up here in the valley was the amount of dogs. Reminds me of when I was in hospital with a dog catcher. He told me in 1 year alone, there's 1,000 dogs had to be destroyed in the valley. He also mentioned the fact he doesn't like the Green Valley Hotel. I said, what's the reason for that? Every time I went down there, somebody would come up and say, you're the dog catcher, aren't you? I'd say, yeah. I'd say, you took my dog today. Crash. My children, they have a mini bike, and they get out there in the backyard with the next door neighbour's kids or a couple of his mates from school come down. My daughter rides. It chops the place about a bit, you know, but the bike's flying around. But it's really great fun. I enjoy it. I'm wrapped in it. There's a lot of things up here for the kids. As for ourselves, you know, we've got the RSL Liverpool Community Club at Mount Pritchard. As yet, the Valley, we haven't managed to get a club. I think it's long past due. Oh, I think we need something here. We've got quite a nice hotel up here at the Valley. I might go down and have a couple of beers, see a couple of mates or something. I mainly drink at home or with my neighbours when they have a barbecue. Norm has a nice home, a swimming pool in his yard. He's buying his home. I invited the film crew to do the camera shots here at the barbecue. It gave me a chance to sit down with my friends and enjoy myself. But drinking at home, you're with your family, and the women seem more contented if they know you're sitting there drinking rather than, say, being down at the hotel and not knowing what time you're going to get home. This sort of activity involves everybody, the whole family. The kids, they're going to find it a bit hard, I suppose. There's nothing up here for the teenager. If he can play football all right, that's pretty good. You got that. In the summer, you got a swimming pool. It's not an adequate swimming pool. But I think they're extending on it now. I'd like to see an ice skating rink or roller skating rink up here. I'd like to see some, I don't know what type, but some type of activity where they can go to dances, organised dances and have a bit of fun. The community centre, it's good. It offers a lot. But we've got to try and look to what the children feel for themselves, what they want. This is what we've got to try and cater for. But the future for them, there's just nothing here. Nothing's been provided. It hasn't been thought out properly. I can see a really big problem ahead. I just hope we're capable of overcoming this problem. We owe it to the kids. We brought them up here. We brought them to Green Valley.
Doc Toomey, who became very interested in the editing period.
You don't want to miss out on Doc Toomey.
Mm-hmm. It's like the whole program just died.
So that might have just been the first chapter.
Could have been, but why wouldn't it stay in QuickTime though?
It might just automatically close once that particular video
Yeah,
is
true.
done, so you might just
You're
have
correct.
to click on the next.
About to give up. Okay.
What's very artistic.
You like it? I mean, it might actually be a problem with the DVD because I can hear it powering away in there trying to play. It's like 8-year-old technology is more than we can handle.
VLC, which is the
Yeah, can you have a look?
Last
That'd be great. Yeah, I was trying. Thank you very much. can hear it in there, like
Yeah.
trying to work.
Do you need to close the QuickTime version?
Ooh.
Is the QuickTime one still running in the background? Because that might give it trouble.
Thank you. See, that's what was happening earlier.
Why has it got no duration?
You know what? I'm just about to give up. What do you think?
If we can.
I haven't had younger around me,
We can
and I think
skip
it's easier to get along with younger
All right,
children than
let's
with
go to
people
this.
your
Yeah.
own age.
Thanks very much.
The younger ones tend to be sympathetic. They mean what they say, whereas older people may be putting on an act. You're not sure. I think when I've finished school, I'd like to get away, but eventually I'd like to come back to the valley and teach. I know a lot of people at school want to get away, not because they don't like the area, because it's just too much. The fact that they want to grow up somewhere else, somewhere they're not relying on other people that they really know. I think you need it to grow up properly.
Stephen Jerd and Wayne Emerson, who worked together on their film and photographed a large part of it.
Well, first of all, they come up to us and they says, you know, we're going to give you a camera and let you do your own shooting. Well, when I started to do the film, when they told me, I knew it would be a big job, so I asked Wayne to come in and help me with it. And I was pretty excited about it, you know. I felt really good and, like, important. I'm 14 and Wayne's 16, and there's a difference in 2 forms at school, and we still got on good with each other and that. And you got a good relationship with all the teachers. Like if you're in trouble, they'll help you out with, you know, anything, even if it's personal. And it's a good school. We're rated 2nd in the state. Yeah, I like school. Yeah, like I think if you don't get a good education, you won't get a good job. Well, the job I'd like to get would be as a policeman or an architect or something like that, you know, because I'm going good in stick drawing and things like this.
Yeah, the film we're making about Green Valley, yeah? What do you think about the people?
Oh, they're really nice. Most people are really friendly.
It's a bit heavy getting chased by those bikies a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm glad it's changed a bit now, but you can walk out at night and feel a bit safer.
Yeah. Do you think any of the people are different towards you than other people because of the long hair and it?
Oh, no, not that here. Everyone's friendly. They'll accept, you know, how you are. Say how you are. Don't take any notice of what you look like.
It's good at the pictures yesterday. It's a pity they haven't got a picture show around here.
Yeah, it's a bit far to go down there, Double Bay.
Lucky they pulled out the car. And it's raining too. They got the bars, but I'm not interested in them very much.
We get too crowded too. There's nothing for the smaller kids to do, like Dale or Paul. Can't do anything. They stay home all weekend.
Yeah. It's okay going to play football and football training and that.
Yeah, if you play football.
No, I do. You don't.
That's the way it is.
Yeah. The only thing we do is go over and mix and play records.
Yeah, most of the time. It's if going down the beach on the weekend or going to the picture sometimes at night, it's a fair way to travel.
I don't think it's right that the kids should stir the foreigners the way they do.
No, I know, not they don't do anything to them. Ross was a good bloke.
Pretty smooth.
Yeah.
Not like the fella around the street that chased me with the stick that night.
He gave us a bit of trouble, didn't he?
Yeah. Oh, well, that was that time. I haven't found any trouble with any of the others, though.
No, you leave them alone, they won't hurt you.
I reckon a lot of them are good blokes.
And that was just because someone pulled the palings out of his fence that he chased you. He thought you did it.
Thought we did it. Oh, well, couldn't be helped, though. I suppose he was upset. Johnny up the road's a good bloke, too. He's a foreigner.
I didn't think he was.
Yeah. He's a really good guy, though.
He's a boxer, too.
Yeah.
We moved up here 4 years ago from Brony, and what I can remember from there was a good area. There's a beach down there, which you haven't got up here, but it was also a violent area. I can remember we used to live on top of a shop, and they used to stay up until all hours of the night, you know, and bikies are down there. And up here, like, it's a lot quieter, and you don't have as much violence, I don't think. Well, Michael and Peter, they were brought up on the beach, and they go down there every weekend in a rain, hail or shine or something. And they don't like it up here really, because there's not so much for them to do, and they go down every weekend. Michael's 18 and Peter's 20, and they're getting pretty old, you know, and they don't really like it up here, so they just go out somewhere else.
What do you think of Green Valley in the way of places to go?
I'll take the question in two parts, if I may. First, what do I think of the valley? I don't like it, never have. And I'll give you the reasons for that in a moment. And places to go, there's no places to go. First, the valley itself. I've been here for 10 years, and I've got 6 kids. I live in a 3-bedroom flat, 3 stories up. There is no place for them to play. There is no privacy at all from anybody. And mainly for that reason, I'd like to get out. I'm getting out as quick as I can. Places to go. I think the only place that I know for the kids to play is a little park down the road here, which is usually clapped out. You know, the harbour machine is not working anyway. The main roads to cross, and there's still a lot of kids. There's I think 23 kids in these 3 blocks of flats for them to play. This is the area they've got to play. But the main basic reason is the moral and you know the mental thing.
How long have you lived here, Mrs. Short?
10.5 years now.
Do you like it?
I love it. I wouldn't live anywhere else.
How could you compare it with the other place where you were living before?
Oh, it just doesn't compare at all. We lived in one lousy little tiny room for 4.5 years waiting for our home.
Yeah.
And we're very pleased with it.
What do you think about the other people in the valley?
Well, I find they treat us as we treat them, and we get on pretty well with most people.
And how are you treated by other people in different areas when you tell them you're from Green Valley?
I don't think I've noticed any difference. There have been a few comments, but I don't think anyone's really been sore at us for living at Green Valley.
Yeah.
I think they find us as we find them.
Sporting activities I mostly do at night because I'm not in any football clubs, and that's karate and scouts. And at karate we learn that once a week, and scouts we go on camps and hikes every weekend practically. I think the main problem in Green Valley is for places to go for the teenager, you know, because the people who are about over 17, they've got their cars and they can go out, and then got the people, say, under 12, later stay around at, you know, go around their friend's place. Maybe a better theatre than Liverpool, because it's not really big enough for the amount of people in Liverpool. And the swimming pools, well, they're not really that good, you know, because they're crowded by the younger people.
The first thing I think I'd ask you people is, the filmmakers out here from your own suburb have become the media themselves. Do you think that they've presented a fair picture of your suburb? Anybody got any thoughts on that? Is that Green Valley?
I think we've been given fair comment.
Sorry?
I think we've been given fair comment. It's the best thing that I've seen on the valley.
Just
fair
raise your
dinkum.
hand if you want to speak.
It's fair dinkum.
Stuff written in black and white by the press some years ago that painted a bad picture of the valley before it even got going.
If I can make one criticism of the film, you've taken the middle of the middle section of this of the valley. You haven't taken the very bads and you haven't taken the very goods. They are mostly very much middle of the class Green Valley people.
There are so many things you could talk about. You could talk about the lack of cultural things, the lack of... Everybody made the point that there was nothing for kids to do. It's all right if you play football, it's all right if the girls play basketball. Beyond that stage, there's nothing much for them to do. There's no creative outlets. And this is why kids become vandals, because they've got to do something. So they can't build anything, so they go and smash a window.
And I think we have a tremendous amount for our young people. I think we need more. I think this is one of the trumpets we can blow as Green Valley Ice. That we have done something where there was nothing. And we have 8,500 primary school in Green Valley at the moment. I think at the moment we have the largest concentration of young people anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere.
There's been nothing done as far as road safety is concerned, where children are constantly getting near misses and getting knocked down. I'd like to see speed limits placed on them. I'd like to see traffic wardens.
Since I've been here, we've buried 8 children under the age of 10 from our church. 8 children. And I know 3 of these were directly responsible. There were no footpaths, and there was wet down little girl had her head down to keep the rain over her eyes and was killed.
So why isn't there a pavement done on the pavements instead of just
people in Green Valley let it go on. We don't worry whether we have footpaths or not.
There should be footpaths, not just mud.
Will the Housing Commission stop building these flats to put the facilities on? And can we stop them building all these flats? For instance, over at Ashcroft Shops, all those flats, there was plenty of flat ground there for carnivals or other amenities where they could go there, you know, if the council paid for it.
I was beating the drum here 2 years ago, and I yelled to the rooftops, please don't build any more flats in Ashcroft because we need what available land there for play area. When I called a meeting of interested parties, we were lucky to get 30, and of the 30 that were there, 5 might have had their say. Now, the Commission tells us that all available land that's left for building in Green Valley as planned originally will be covered by flats. Now, I believe, and I'm told by the Commission and by the planning authorities, there are more parks and open space per head of the population than any other suburb in Green Valley. And I say this as well, God help the other suburbs.
Now, Mr. Kane, I met before from the Housing Commission. Sorry to put you on the spot, but what do you think of the points that have been presented? Do you think the Housing Commission has a further role to play once the area has been established in facilities?
I feel that we should emphasise the image, or upgrade the image of the valley. I think that we've got to do this. I think once you get this going amongst the people, you're going to start the ball rolling and it's going to improve. Now the Commission itself, I'm only an employee, I've worked out here 7 years, I've seen a lot of changes, improvements, there's a lot of faults, I must admit.
I was interested in whether the Commission can or cannot devote more finance in areas once the community is established.
The thing is that the land is given to the council and they, in turn, expect the councils to devote funds to develop these areas as best they can. The Commission has established the area. It pays a lot of rates to council on behalf, everybody pays rents, and that's part of the deal, and it goes to council. I think pressure should be brought to bear more on council by the residents of the area themselves.
Both the federal member and the state member for Parliament are elected purely on the majority of Green Valley alone. The Liverpool member and sort of the member for Werriwa, Gough Whitlam, is elected purely on their majority that they get from Green Valley, and therefore they owe Green Valley representation, because without them they wouldn't be where they are now.
Very interesting point. You've got a real lobby
It's all right for us, grown-ups. We've all had a little say here, but I think I'd like to hear one of the teenagers. It's all right, we're quite stable in what we want, but what does the teenagers want? Let one of them come up now and tell us what they want.
Speaking as a teenager, there's nothing to complain about here in the Valley. I mean, compare it to a suburb of Sydney, living down there. People say there's nothing for the teenagers and everything. They say youth groups like Captain Harris's group would, you know, be confined to the people under 12, but people between the 12 and 18-year-old age group, they are just as enthusiastic and just as fond of going to these musical groups and youth groups and playing football. I mean, a main percentage of the population here is fond of doing that.
Say I want to go to the pictures. There's one picture show in Liverpool. I won't mention the name or anything. And last Monday night, my younger brother, when he's 16, and it cost him $1.20 to get into the theatre, and it started to rain, and the rain came through the roof. I'm 18 years old, and I've got nothing to do up here. I'm not interested in, how can I say, theatre work like Captain Harris has arranged and things like this. I'd like to be able to go into the city now and then, but it's impossible unless I've got a car or something like this, because it takes hours to get in there.
I have 3 teenage daughters ranging from the ages of 14 to 17. Now, the lack of facilities, not so much in Green Valley, but within a couple of miles radius of Green Valley too, is inadequate to the point that there is absolutely nothing that they can go to.
And I think Liverpool itself as a city has not grown with the population. Green Valley is actually about the same size of Orange. We have a police station which is like a local toilet. I mean, that's what I thought it was when they were building it. We have, I think, 3 officers in that police station that control the tremendous area of Green Valley. And quite frankly, I'm amazed we have as few problems as we do.
Most of us, we all come from, I think, the city, the inner city area, through the state government and the assistance of the Commission. We came out here to live. We didn't really want to come here, we wanted to live in the city, but this was where we had to make our home. Now I think it's the state government and the Commission, along with ourselves, should make this effort. But it can't be just left to the people here. It's got to be mainly the government, secondly the Commission for not having these facilities already provided, and then us.
One thing that hasn't been raised, and I think a lot of people have problems with this, and this is the transport problem. I don't know whether there's a railway line or a main highway that can be made into Green Valley, or better bus facilities or something, but I know there's a tremendous amount of people up in Heckenberg and Busby and all around there that just have to miss out on so much because they can't get down into this area.
I think there's plenty of activities to do. It's just whether the
I'm going to give up. Now I'm going to give up. It's got to be I thank you for the assistance, but I'm sure it's the actual hardware that's causing this problem. Okay, look. Don't feel like you've certainly got a good sense of what's being put forward here. And in fact, we were so close to the end. The end is that slightly feisty Salvation Army guy saying we're going to have a town meeting next week or something. Who's in and who's out? So he throws down the gauntlet to the assembled residents, and he makes this this kind of challenge that they might now all come together and provide solutions. I'm assuming that the problems are kept going apace from that time, because certainly there's that particular part of the world continues to have quite a bit of stigma attached to it. It was some of you may remember the politician Mark Latham, who was a Labor politician, leader of the Labor Party, probably about 12, 13 years ago. He's since, many people feel that he's since sort of gone mad, but he was notoriously from that very deprived part of the world. He may well have been in that audience for all we know as a child. So the Green Valley story is a sort of can stand in for as an ongoing example of a lot of those kinds of housing estates in particular around Australia, and more importantly, I think, from my point of view, more importantly than a story about public housing, it's a story about people being invited to put forward, what would you call it, solutions to their local problems, and they're being asked to confer. I mean, it's in some ways it's a much more, from our point of view, you know, there are no real mechanisms for people to make requests of government for facilities and so on. It would be much more difficult than it would be today for people to get heard. And you can tell, you know, we have that. So we have the Salvation Army guy, Captain Harris, I think his name was, who's, you know, obviously taking a role as a commentator and some sort of facilitator for the wider community. But you know, so there's those non-government organisations are stepping in and saying things. But essentially, I think that those people are somewhat out on their own. And they feel stranded. So when Peter Weir et al. Come to town and say, we're going to make a film, you can see why someone would come forward and want to be heard, quite apart from the, you know, this is obviously a time when being on film is exciting enough in itself. I remembered while we were watching that, someone was making a follow-up movie in 2015. They were making a part 2. Certainly wasn't Peter Weir, but someone was making a local film. So I must follow that up and see if there's any kind of, you know, 40 years later kind of story. One of the things that did definitely change for the people of Green Valley and Australia, and the name is mentioned. Someone mentions that Gough Whitlam was the federal member for that area, and Whitlam. That was,
when was that?
1973. That film came out.
Okay.
But he must have been, like, by that time he must have been the Prime Minister.
72 to 75.
Yes. So probably 72 that film was made, and Whitlam was just poised to become Prime Minister, which he did indeed happen. And one of the famous things about Whitlam, and one of the things that people talk about as being his achievement, was that he gained federal government in part because he paid attention to very local concerns that would have been seen as state or even local government issues. Notably, he sewered the western suburbs of Sydney. So the people of Green Valley, I don't know if Green Valley was sewered in 1972, but Whitlam famously put money into that kind of infrastructure for that, you know, million or so people who lived in the western suburbs of Sydney who didn't have those kinds of facilities. Extraordinary to think of now, but that was how it was. So, what I want to talk to you about now is why I don't really want to talk to you about why my brain has completely faded and I now can't find the lecture that I put so much work into, but it'll come to me in a second. Okay, it will come to me in a second.
Can I interrupt? Who's seen
Yes.
Master and Commander? No one? It's a really good film. You should watch it.
Is it good?
I loved it. I wanted to watch it immediately after watching it the first time.
Okay.
I wanted to spend like 5 hours of my life watching it. I never would have watched it, like just looking at the cover and just looking at, you know, the topic, but it was recommended to me and I went, okay, I'll give some of my life over to watching this. And then I realised I'd made a huge mistake by not watching it. It's excellent.
Okay, well, has anyone here ever seen anyone have a nervous breakdown? I can't find my copy. What next? I mean, I know you think, you know, I'm just a doddery old fool who can't work technology, and I am, but still, I have been doing this for a long time. You think it would be reasonably easy to find these...
Shall we have a 5-minute break?
Let's have a 5-minute break. Thank you, Rebecca. That's a great idea. 5-minute break. I'll have a breakdown. You have a break. Jeez Louise. Okay, look, so I went onto my laptop, do you need to know this? Maybe not. While the film was showing, just to add an extra slide onto the end of my PowerPoint, and apparently I demolished it in the course of doing so, because now that file has been removed. So what I will do is, this was the lecture from a couple of weeks ago that was supposed to come after Lauren's lecture, and I think it covers some of the bases. I then co-opted it into another lecture. You don't need to know that. Let's just get through this and try and salvage something out of today. I'm sorry that your time's been wasted in so many ways up to this point. I guess that's what life's like, really, isn't it? It's just wasting time, right? So democracy and equality does come into the story here, and I'll try and make some connections between Green Valley, and I'll try and recall some of the other good things that I had in store for you this hour, and then we'll try and put the whole thing behind us and pretend it never happened. Okay, I will anyway. So one of the things that I know James touched on a bit last week, and we've all touched on it in various ways, and it's an ongoing issue and a story that we need to keep in mind, is this notion of gentrification, and we're thinking about gentrification all the time. I don't know if you're familiar with Neil Smith and the idea of the revanchist city, the notion that revanchism is a 19th century concept whereby one group of people reclaim a territory, a terrain, as traditionally their own. Neil Smith and the revanchist city. Smith is suggesting that the gentrification is a process of, wealthy people reclaiming the inner city, which has become the domain of the poor. So, that little moment in the first Ron's section of Whatever Happened to Green Valley, he talks about Balmain. I mean, he's actually talking about it being too expensive. I'm not entirely sure what rents would have been like in Balmain in the early 70s. I think they would have been cheap as chips in a way, but I suspect that more likely what he's really talking about is the availability of places that are suitable for families to live in. Nevertheless, look, I suppose I shouldn't argue with someone's direct testimony from the time, and he is talking 45 years ago about a place like Balmain being a difficult place to find somewhere to live. I certainly recall older people when I lived in Sydney talking about how they were persuaded to give up inner city homes with the promise of a bigger block of land and a more modern house somewhere else in the Sydney suburbs, and being gleefully taking it, and then 10 years later looking back and going, oh, wait a minute, that house that I left, that I was so happy to leave at one point, is now massively valuable and expensive. And if I'd held out a little longer, particularly people who owned their homes, if I'd held out a little longer, I'd now be a millionaire. I mean, even the time when I moved to Sydney in the mid 80s, and it was most definitely the inner city of Sydney was seen as an appalling place, and I had co-workers laughing at me for living in Redfern, as though anyone would actually voluntarily live in a suburb so close to the CBD, and I mean, there was a bit of racism in that laughter as well, but obviously not directed at me. But the point still holds. The gentrification has made a major impact on Australian cities in the last 30 years, and it's been a particular story that has, in large part, and I think James touched on this quite a bit, has in large part been about heritage, and in some ways heritage has been the device by which gentrification has taken hold. It's moved, as Neil Smith predicted, it moves beyond that and into arguments about denser housing in the inner city and so on. But I'm just going to take you through some of the issues. As you can possibly tell, I'm a little bit flustered by the fact that my actual lecture is dead, and this is my makeshift lecture, but we'll see how we go. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was very privileged to be invited to co-author a book with two eminent historians. And look, I'm the meat and the sandwich here between Renata Howe and Graham Davison on this book called Trendyville. I always say to people in this instance, this book, we didn't want to do this. We wanted to be provocative with that title. It was Graham's idea. And but really, the book should really have a question mark after that Trendyville name. So Trendyville was a term that was occasionally applied to the inner city of Melbourne as a place where trendy being I guess a kind of 1970s version of hipster in a way, not quite, but sort of. Someone who was a slave to fashion, who was alternative lifestyle, as a personal statement, and who quite possibly made things difficult for themselves and others as a kind of expression of self. So the trendies were the people who colonised the inner city, again, middle-class people who came in to the inner city, the pioneers. As they came in, they would talk... Oh, for God's sake. They would... It's just one thing after another. This is like...
The ceiling hasn't crushed in yet.
No, exactly. Thank you, Rebecca. That's the final scene. This is... Fucking hell. It's a lintel. They've got to get a lintel out. What's a lintel? I don't know what a lintel is. Maybe they'll come and show it to us. That'll be the next thing. Come and see this fine lintel we've extracted. Okay. So, I'm going to persist, because I'm brave. So the notion of the trendy is the idea of a middle-class person who comes and colonises the working-class area, and they use, in many instances, the rhetoric of heritage. They want to preserve a place. They want to preserve something that they might relate to national history, or they might relate it to some notion of the way that people should live, like a more natural lifestyle, a less materialistic lifestyle, although ironically often materialism is one of the motivating factors, whether it's known or unknown. I had the pleasure, it's one of the first things we did for the Trendyville book, was we had a seminar at the Richmond Town Hall where a lot of people came together who moved to Carlton and Simmer and Fitzroy in the 70s, and their story was often they were like, I bought a house in Carlton, it cost me $8,000, it was slated to be demolished by the Housing Commission, but it was still cheaper to pay $8,000 over 5 years, which was as long as we expected the house would still be standing before it was demolished. And my parents thought I was mad because who would want to live in Carlton, but I persisted, and now I own a $2 million property. I'm slightly embarrassed about it, but I'm also really happy it's the best choice I ever made. This was a fairly common story that we heard. All right, so the context for the 1960s and 70s, and I'm talking here about Melbourne primarily, was, for instance, people in Australia realising in the late 60s that they had the possibility of political agency, that they were in fact, not necessarily happy with the way that the government was running the show, and they thought that they could possibly make a difference, particularly with people power. One of the, this is a photograph of one of the most extraordinary events in mid-20th century Australian history, which was the Vietnam moratorium protests, I think 69 or 70, I'm not entirely sure of the year. That's not important. You can see that's the Melbourne Town Hall there, and you can see that people are everywhere in the main streets of Melbourne, a city which notoriously, at that time anyway, didn't really have a place for people to gather and protest, but they found a way. They got out in the street and they basically closed the city down for a while with protests against the Vietnam War, against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War in the 1960s. It was, at that time, the biggest public protest ever seen in Australia. There's been a bigger one since. This was anti-war protest of, if I remember rightly, the early this century, which was bigger, but Melbourne was a bigger place then, and there were, so it's still I think a smaller per head of population. It's just opposite the State Library. Okay, so where does the impulse for protest come from? Particularly, those anti-war protests don't directly relate to urban issues, but they do borrow some of the rhetoric of urban protest, and they feed back into urban protest. People start to realise or start to have ideas about the value of public protest and people power. Saul Alinsky is often put forward as a what if it's the lintel that holds the building up? I like the way they said, we were told there were no lectures on between 1 and 2. And it's like, well, now we know that there are. We'll just keep going with this lintel removal. Got to get that. You can't have a lintel sitting there. It's like a infected tooth. So Alinsky was a prominent social activist in Chicago until his death. He notoriously was a big influence, or his legacy was a big influence on the work of Barack Obama in Chicago in the 90s and the early 21st century. So Alinsky had a renewed prominence like long after his death because he had such an influence on a man who then went on to be president. But what Alinsky did was he mobilised working class people in Chicago to get better outcomes for their own lives, in particularly when it comes to just the things that make ordinary people's lives a little more functional and bearable, things to do with amenities and also things like wages and so on. He was very active in an area known as the Back of the Yards, which is a strange name for a place, but it was actually a part of Chicago, still is, that was adjacent to, I think, abattoirs, and so it was, the dirtiest, nastiest work that most people wouldn't want to do, and the people that lived there were Back of the Yards people, and they did the work in this kind of powerhouse of the meat industry in Chicago, and they were living there, and they were in some ways, I think, they had a bit of stigma of their own, partly just because they worked in those industries, but they came to see themselves, they had that kind of stubborn pride which people in that situation will often have, and Alinsky and others were able to bring them together in protest, and he had all kinds of extraordinary. You should investigate him. Some of it's quite funny. He writes very engagingly, and he put together, as mentioned, this book, Rules for Radicals. He put together a kind of book that, or not a kind of book, an actual book that put out all kinds of ideas about how you could cajole embarrass, mobilise to get what you want as a community in a capitalist society. So one of the people that it was very essential that that I covered in this course ASAP is Jane Jacobs. I know it's been brought up before, and I'm sure that many of you are absolutely au fait, at least in précis with the work of Jane Jacobs and her legacy and her iconic status. I'm here to tell you that you should definitely read the Jacobs book, The Life and Death of Great American Cities. You should also, like almost anything that you encounter anywhere in life ever, you should take the Jacobs story with a grain of salt. She was acting at a particular time. She had particular, I'm not saying she was corrupt, not in any way, but she was certainly, her understanding of planning in the 1950s and 60s was an outsider's understanding, and she had a response, a reaction. She was an excellent writer. She had some very, very good points to make, and she made them. She also has a kind of a backstory that's really intriguing and interesting too. So protesting against planning is something that I think is something that we need to consider as a particularly aligned to an era whereby modernist planning has come into being. The planners are finally in control, and there are a lot of people who aren't really happy with what the planners are doing, and they're using that very prescriptive recipe for ideal planning. They're talking with the vigour and the excitement of a group of people who are going to get everyone out of the slums, who are going to get everyone out of the 19th century and into the modern, scientifically proven 20th century. Step into that. This particular gentleman, Robert Moses, and Moses is notoriously, you probably know some of this story. There's quite a few iterations of this story. There was recently a biography published of Jacobs, and there have been some really nice books published about Moses, for that matter. But Moses was essentially a bureaucrat who took to his heart the notion of saving the people of New York from the old and the bad and the decrepit and the disgusting. He embraced the motor age, and he embraced all the ideals of the value of the motor car and the possibilities that the motor car brought to everyday people. He was very into slum clearance. He was very into new public housing. He was also, it has tended to be felt these days, he was knowingly or unknowingly, probably knowingly, more on the side of the middle to upper classes than the poor. He was more likely to make new places, attractive new places, specifically for the wealthy than for others. Whether it was a conscious bias or an unconscious bias is, perhaps people aren't quite certain about that yet, but there does seem to have been a bias in Moses' actions. So you can see here these, spaghetti-like freeway designs that Moses is, commissioning and advocating for, where, it's all about the primacy of the motor car. Moses thought of himself and talked about himself as a bully for the people, which is a beautiful phrase. And Moses is thinking about how he is, he's setting himself up as against particularly the vested interests of landlords. He's saying, people are being, particularly poor people, are being exploited by situations where landlords can charge all kinds of rents because it's done in, I guess, hidden in plain sight in a way. The landlords are the enemy and the people are the victims, and Moses, is throwing his weight around in New York, and he's getting things done. He has to make some tough decisions now and again. He has to do some mean things sometimes, but it's all for the greater good, I think, is his idea. So slum clearance is part of his métier, and he presides over the largest slum clearance program in New York in the 1950s. There's a secretive selection of sites and sponsors. There's privatisation of relocation, and there's definitely opposition to preservation. He's anti-democratic in many ways, but he sees, I don't know if "but" is really the right word to use, but he sees himself as doing the greater good. Some good examples, and this particular area is germane to what I'm about to talk about in a minute. An idealised picture of a particular a Moses project. Okay, so in 1960 there is a committee set up amongst people in Manhattan to stop the Lower Manhattan Expressway. Why would you want to stop something as beautiful as this? Well, it's seen as intruding or destroying people's lifestyles, people who've lived in this particular part of the world for a long time, who are exercising their own culture and having their own, minding their own business. And it's seen that Moses et al. Are using capital and perhaps to a certain degree doing the bidding of big corporations by trying to create these kinds of places in New York. In the early 60s, Jane Jacobs and others are instrumental in preventing the building of a roadway through this particular piece of parkland. Now you can see there already is a road through there, but this is going to be a major traffic road, not a small, local access road, I suppose you'd call it. And this is known as Washington Square Gardens. So, a lot of pictures of Moses looking longingly and covetously at big infrastructure. Here's what Moses wanted to do through Washington Square Park. Sorry, not Gardens is the housing area to the south. Washington Square Park, and in this instance, 30,000 signatures were collected on a petition demanding that instead of running this major roadway through their park and dividing it essentially into two parks, one on either side of a major road, that this little road be closed, and that the whole plan be thwarted. Moses instantly said, well, in this case, what will happen is, and this was the kind of rhetoric that Moses was using for what it's worth, was if we don't allow a road through here, then traffic will just back up and we'll have a sort of permanent traffic jam. In fact, the Manhattan grid more or less just kept things, the traffic diffused either side. Here's another revised proposal and a model of the area. So in this instance, Jacobs and other people who rallied against this proposal, which they saw as destroying their neighbourhood and local amenity, they won. There's a picture of Jane Jacobs winning, and from this and other similar observations that she'd made, as well as interventions that she'd been a part of, Jacobs wrote this this book, two versions of it there. That's my copy on the right. Not sure I got the other one on the left from. Jacobs is, you know, she's, as I say, she's outside the planning world. She's not a planner. She's lauded far and wide as the great influence on planning in the late 20th century because, you know, she does really strike at the heart of some of those tenets of planning. For instance, that, you know, to plan is to comprehensively replan and to, you know, destroy and rebuild, those kinds of things. So she talks about the pernicious influence of early 20th century planning on planning in 1961 when she's publishing her book, and how you know, the planners are anti-city, that planners have set in play powerful, this is a quote, powerful and city-destroying ideas. She talks about Ebenezer Howard in particular. Why she singles him out, I don't know, but she says that he simply wrote off the intricate, many-faceted cultural life of the metropolis. And her book flew very much in the face of conventional planning philosophy. She claimed cities need old buildings so badly, it is probably impossible for vigorous streets and districts to grow without them. And she praised the apparently accidental mixed use of old quarters of cities for safety, usability, vitality and sustainability in the old sense of sustainability. Here's a great book that's worth looking at about, you know, Jacobs and Moses at loggerheads in many ways, more ideologically than in reality, because apparently they met like once, but they are linked in many people's minds. They were active in more or less the same place at the same time, and they made a big, you know, huge change. And, you know, Jacobs is generally speaking, for all good reasons, considered to be the winner, I think, of that story, at least ideologically, the moral winner. So I quickly want to talk to you about a few local cases, and one that I just find personally fascinating, so I can't leave it out of the story, which is the mid-1960s example of the Perth Barracks. I don't know how many people here are from Perth, I'm not going to ask you, but or how many of you have been to Perth, I'm not going to ask you that either. It's a story that I'll get through quickly. The Perth Barracks is, as you can see, an 1860s building, so it's long existed. It long existed in Perth, so it's just a little under 100 years old when the Brand government in Western Australia decided it was time to demolish it so that people in Perth itself could get a better view of the new Parliament House. It wasn't being used functionally, particularly for anything. It was no longer a barracks building, and it was seen by many as a bit of a blight on Perth, which was a city which had been very comprehensively rebuilt through the 50s and 60s. What happened next was actually quite fascinating for a city that, like Perth, which is considered, I think, to be reasonably conservative and, you know, in many ways kind of mundane. People who don't trouble themselves too much to do too much to worry about their environment or their lives. There was a big campaign in the 60s to preserve democracy, and I guess that's what I really love, is the conflation of the barracks story, the idea of keeping the barracks building, and the notion of democracy. So it is actually people saying we want to maintain this building in part because we deserve a say in our environment and what goes on in our city. It's not, we may have elected the Brand government, or some of us did, but we don't necessarily want them to go about pulling things down that we have a personal affection for, just because, you know, they feel like it. So, in a time when post-war planning itself is strong, there is a lot of unhappiness about a lack of consultation, a lack of responsivity to changing conditions, a lack of transparency in planning bodies, the paternalistic attitudes that prevailed at this time, disregard for community feeling and requests for dialogue, and a feeling that there's planning is going on for its own sake rather than to enhance the environment necessarily. Now the sad story is, so this is the barracks arch, which is at the front of the barracks itself. By the time the people won, so to speak, in Perth, all that was left was the arch. So the building itself is not really there, and there is the barracks arch, and there were continuous requests to pull this thing down, because all it is really is it's almost a lintel in the landscape there that needs to be pulled out and thrown away, doesn't it? But it's nevertheless stayed there, and I suppose there are probably, that was 50 years ago, there are probably many, many people who don't even appreciate that there was more of a building behind the barracks arch or associated with it than just the archway, which has become a kind of symbol in itself. So this was the kind of stuff that we dealt with in the Trendyville book, which I'll try and give you a quick précis of. What with all the rubbish that's gone on, we don't have much time anyway. In the early 70s in Melbourne, here we have the two Liberal premiers who presided over Melbourne and Victoria in the 60s and 70s. On the right there, that funny old man is Henry Bolte. You may know his bridge, which has nothing to do with him except that it was named after him. And Hamer on the left, the dashing and handsome Rupert Hamer, who someone decided in the 60s that it was a little bit fey to be called Rupert, so they made up a nickname for him, Dick, but which doesn't really work much. It doesn't work that well either, does it? But anyway, so these were the two guys who ran the state and the city through the 60s and 70s. And what they were doing, Bolte in particular, was one of those stories of a guy who sort of got into power almost by accident in the mid-50s, and he stayed for as long as he felt like it. He stayed for 16 or 17 years and was reviled or loved, depending on who you were. What he did do was he ran a very strong and authoritative housing commission. So in the mid-50s, Bolte was as convinced as anyone that Melbourne had problems that needed to be fixed by large-scale demolition and building of new buildings, particularly in the inner city where the poor people lived and where people were living in squalor. And there was a lot of squalid housing in Melbourne. You can see all those black bits that are, it speaks for itself, doesn't it, that article? Nearly 1,000 acres of slum, so I can't translate that into real measurements. And you can see where they all are as well. This is a time when 19th century housing stock was seen by many as fairly repulsive. And that caption is actually on a review of... what is it a review of? I was going to say a review of a book by Graham Davison, but that seems unlikely. He would have been too young then. But I think Graham was involved in some way in that article. And so this was, the idea of anyone desiring, finding Victorian architecture attractive was fairly risible. In the early 1970s, this is a still from a film called The Demolition of St Patrick's College. You may know St Patrick's College in East Melbourne, the old college building, which was a very beautiful Georgian building. The Catholic Church decided that it was old and in the way, and was able to make this decision that we're just going to demolish this. Hamer said that had he been Premier, he was Premier a year later, but this was under Bolte's stewardship, and Bolte didn't care about this kind of stuff. Bolte didn't trouble himself too much about the city at all. Hamer said that he would have saved St Patrick's College. As it was, it more or less went. One of these towers is still there, so it's a little bit of a Barracks Arch situation. We are constantly reminded of that there was a really nice building here, and now here's a bit of it, just to keep you unhappy about that scenario. So there was no sense in the early 70s of a national estate or the value of older buildings and so on. The Housing Commission is, that actually says the enemy within our gates. The Housing Commission is making a case for how old and dilapidated housing is destroying families and creating miserable conditions for inner city people. And instead, its response, we know this story, I suppose, its response is this kind of housing style. We still see examples of this around Melbourne, and this kind as well. And notoriously, the Housing Commission becomes a kind of a monolith that it's hard to stop, because it goes into the business of large-scale prefabricated building. So it has a factory down in Holmes Glen, on the way to Glen Waverley, which it uses to create big prefabricated concrete components. And so you can see how the kind of the momentum of this is a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As long as we are manufacturing things on this scale, we have people, we have employees, and we have the materials coming in, and we're making things. We have to keep making these huge, high-rise public housing skyscrapers. Hence, this kind of thing, which is, I think, only like 2 minutes from where we are right now, 2 minutes walk, up in Carlton. There's the cemetery there. I'm a little bit lost, but that's okay. The Carlton Flats. And this, on the left, if I remember rightly, is a bit of Housing Commission publicity with the attractive bathrooms and so on. On the right is an image from an article in a short-lived magazine called Broadside, which criticised the Housing Commission and its activities, and showed this what was probably considered to be a fairly poignant image of a little girl riding a wheeled, a bicycle scooter or whatever it is, down the corridors of this high-rise housing. She can't go out and play in the park space because she can't be supervised there, so she has to make her own entertainment, possibly in a quite lonely fashion. This here on the left, this is actually put forward as an attractive option by the Housing Commission. They are the saddest family you've ever seen in your life when it comes down to it, but they are living in clean and comfortable conditions, technologically superior and efficient. This is when we start to see anti-Housing Commission and anti-government housing generally, anti-demolition, anti-urban renewal rhetoric coming into play in Melbourne in the late 60s, early 70s. Here's Broadside's take on it, which is, if you need me to explain it, I don't know why you would, but the idea being, okay, you think you're getting rid of slums. In fact, the High-Rise Housing Commission are just slums in the sky. At the same time, we have new media campaigns and media instruments that start to bring attention to the problems inherent in this program that seemed to be out of control. And at the same time, in Carlton News, which becomes the Melbourne Times, is absolutely a part of the gentrification story, without a doubt. It makes its money out of real estate advertising, and it is very, very involved in advocating on behalf of local traders in Carlton and so on. So it wants to keep the inner city vibrant and alive, and it's very into the gentrification program. Perhaps in some ways unconsciously at first, but eventually that is what it's doing. So this is the kind of anti-housing commission, anti-freeway rhetoric that's being put forward in the 60s and 70s. The Carlton Association newsletter starts to talk about the damaging aspects of freeways, and this is a good map for our purposes because, as you can see, this is a proposal to run freeways to an extent that we at this university would be affected as well. A big main road, well, it is main road still, isn't it? But between the university and the cemetery, and a freeway that runs not very far from our southern border of the old university, probably would be right through university buildings. So not only do we have, so that's from 1973, not only do we have this housing urban renewal story that people are resisting, we also have a freeway program that is seen as absolutely unresponsive to local conditions, uncaring, all about getting people from the outside the edges of town into town. Often talked about as being, it's just so that the male breadwinner of particular wealthy eastern suburbs can drive into the city and park his car in close to work. When I was a child, and this must have been about 73 or 74, we had scholastic workbooks and so on. And believe it or not, and this is the Victorian Education Department producing this, this is a little poem that is totally opposed to the idea of living in an apartment house. The government on one hand is saying we have to house hundreds of thousands of people in apartments, and on the other hand, another arm of the government is filling school children's heads with this kind of rhetoric. This gentleman, Andrew McCutcheon, you can see him on he's the gentleman in the picture, died last year, very prominent in housing issues. He was a state government minister for some time in the 70s. The reason that I've included this image here is that McCutcheon was also an architect, and he produced designs for houses in Clifton Hill. You may know them, opposite the Darling Gardens. And he owned one, lived in it. And the main purpose of these houses was to show that you could produce adequate housing at the same density of high-rise housing, but in a low-rise townhouse form. So it was the same amount of people could be housed under these circumstances in 2 or 3 story houses with small gardens at the front and the back, but they didn't need to be taken so far away from the ground and from nature. And I guess one of the things that the density of the High-Rise Housing Commission was in part ameliorated by the enormous open spaces that those buildings were put in, and McCutcheon envisaged a kind of a more equitable share of that kind of thing amongst private owners. Those houses, by the way, sold for between 16 and 1900,000 each. I imagine they're probably worth a little bit more these days. A conservation report, in this instance about South Yarra, a anti-housing commission, basically anti-housing commission pro-Carlton. You can see the Save Carlton signs. We use this on the cover of the Trendyville book. This is the burning in effigy of the housing minister in the early 70s. His name was Ray Marr. Very nice. Someone put a lot of work into that effigy, and it's the image of it's being burnt outside the Housing Commission offices was in some ways quite iconic. So we have these twin angles of the fear of what the Housing Commission Urban Renewal Program was doing to the inner city, and the fear of what a roads program would do to the inner city. And some of these images show us the way that people were regarding this twin scenario at this time. And at the same time, here we have Rupert Hamer as a waiter in service of the car. The car's reading a menu, and Hamer's giving the car whatever it wants, in this case the Malvern Freeway, but you know, just the freeway program generally. There's a strong sense as more middle-class people, often people associated with this university, move into places like Carlton and Fitzroy, there's a sense that this is a part of the world that needs to be saved in that kind of low-rise form, and that its actual appearance, its agedness, are all core elements of its appeal and its value. This all comes to a head in the early 70s with the Brooks Crescent campaign, and I included an image of Brooks Crescent here because there was a theory at the time, and I don't think anybody knows the truth of this, that the Housing Commission were particularly singling out this part of Fitzroy because the Housing Commission didn't like this, that it was so, it looked so haphazard, and it was such a strange little twisted street that that really offended the Housing Commission, but who knows the truth of that. Brooks Crescent had this little park space in the middle of it, and these classic workers' cottages. There is a strong anti-Housing Commission. You can see the Brooks Crescent name on the banner, second from the front there. A strong anti-Housing Commission protest, and there are some characters in the Brooks Crescent scenario, not least this lady whose name unfortunately I can't recall, but who not only, this is her winning, she won the right to continue to own and live in her house there. She's also seen in a slide that I don't have, or in an image that I don't have on a slide, she's seen standing in front of her house with a gun, saying, once again, the poster, that the house is not for sale to the Housing Commission. So there's a sense that local people are determined to preserve their homes and their way of life in this scenario. So this has been, I don't know about you guys, you're fine, but I've found this extremely stressful 2 hours, but I feel like I have finally delivered a little bit of content, but not necessarily the content I would have liked to have delivered exactly. But I think we've got ourselves up to a certain point. Next week is going to be much more fulfilling and exciting. We're going to have our guest speaker, Libby Porter, is going to come. Professor Libby Porter of RMIT is going to come and talk about Indigenous planning, and that will be a really great hour or two. Rebecca's a fan.
I love Libby. Libby's great. You have to hear Libby talk.
You have to hear Libby talk. She's really, really good. And hopefully the lintel will be removed by next week, and there won't be any more of these kind of crazy interruptions. So thank you very much. I'll see you next week. No, it wasn't.
Super useful.
I hope so. Thank you. Thank you for your help. Oh, man.
And now it's going to be quiet, like they're finished.
What do you mean?
Did you want to go for a coffee at all?
I can't. I've got a...